Yes, as Professor Ananya, been actually, let me again welcome you, warm welcome again.
Thank you.
And one of your recent article, I think it's widely cited, of this private stagnancy in the private investment.
Right.
That's the question. So now, since India has been, that since 2003, particularly since post-reform, has been having a remarkable growth if we compare with the previous pre-reform period. And one of the drivers definitely is the private investment of the growth that took place since 90s, and particularly that was more evident since 2003. So now there seems to be some kind of stagnation. Of course, you will also see the numbers that has peaked in 2007-8. Then since then it's been on
a down.
So what do you think as key explanatory factors of the drivers of growth earlier? Then what has now happened, or that which you see as an important factors driving that of the stagnancy?
So if you look at a standard economic textbook approach, there are two sets of drivers of private investments. One comes from the cost side, the cost of investments or the opportunity cost of funds, and that is the rate of interest. So the cost of funds or the rate of interest is one of the textbook drivers of private investments. And the other one comes from what is called the accelerator theory, which is the level of aggregate demand. The rate of growth of output or the rate of growth of demand is supposed to be the other factor that that influences the rate of growth of investments. So investments in India, they really peaked as a percentage of GDP during what has been described as India's dream run. Now this is something this term was used by Professor Nagaraj, who in his EPW article talked about India's dream run, which lasted from about 2003-4 to 2007-8. Now that's when private investments, and here investments of course are of two types. Investments undertaken by the private corporate sector and investments that is undertaken by the household sector. So if you look at basic macro theory, it tells you that one of the primary drivers of growth is private corporate investments. So when I talk about investments, I'm really talking about private corporate investments. So what we saw under peak conditions of private corporate investments was amazing growth in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand from two sources, from domestic sources as well as from external sources. So there was amazing amount of increase in exports, because prior to the global financial crisis, world economy grew at a very stable and at a very fast pace. So if you look at the period from the Asian economic crisis, which was 1997, to 2007-8, which was the global financial crisis, the world economy really had a very stable and a period which was marked by amazing amount of stability and robust growth. So external demand was definitely one factor which spurred investments. And the other was the kind of growth that the Indian economy witnessed. Post 1991, we had a break from trend. Earlier, there was what is known what has been described as the Hindu rate of growth, a very low and a stable rate of growth. There was a distinct break from that trend post 1991, and 2003 to 2007-8 was amazing in that you had a break from the 1991 trend and India grew at almost 9% per annum. So that kind of growth in domestic demand along with external demand was something that spurred investment, and we saw the investment ratio equal the kind of investment that East Asia has seen. And many have actually described this as India's experience of export-led growth. So if you try to analyze the slowdown, I think both factors are at play. The global economy has not really settled down since the 2007-8 crisis. One after the other, you had destabilizing events. You had the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone. You had Brexit. Then you had the conflict, which in the shape of the Russia-Ukraine war. And now, of course, along with that war continuing, you have trouble in the Middle East. And now America is trying to put in place a new world order. So we have not had anything that equals the kind of stability that the world economy witnessed post the Asian crisis and prior to the global financial crisis. So external demand therefore has not given the kind of stable stimulus that investment requires. That's one. And if you look at domestic demand, the government of the day has certainly spent a lot on capital expenditure and tried to boost domestic demand. But by and large, this government's approach has been a supply side one. If you look at the way they responded to COVID, if you look at the slew of measures they have on the credit side, they have tried to build a startup ecosystem. They have given out a lot of these small loans for women, for small entrepreneurs, the mudra loans, right? During COVID also, the entire focus was to provide for food so that nobody goes hungry for lack of job. But by and large, it was entirely through the monetary policy that we had a moratorium on loans. We had sort of debts being held at bay, and repayment conditions being eased, right? So the focus of this government has actually been more on the supply side than on the demand side. Having said that, so what is happening on the demand side, given that we are having so much capex that is being undertaken? So if you look at the 2003-2008 Dream Run episode, that actually lay out a lot of capacity so far as the infrastructure sector was concerned. And we have not had demand growth, we have not had GDP growth which equals the kind we saw during the Dream Run. So what you have had is underutilization of the built up capacities. Capacity utilization rates haven't really crossed about, it hasn't been more than about 75-76%, right? So I think there are two sides to the capex. A, it's adding to demand, and B, it's adding to capacity at a time when capacity utilization rates are not up to full capacity. So maybe overall it is, the demand side effects of the capacity expansion is simply not enough to boost investments on the scale that is required. Because again, if you look at the Indian context, the evidence suggests that investments are not that sensitive to the rate of interest. They are sensitive to the rate of interest, but the interest rate channel of monetary policy is not what is driving investments in
so
the
just to address before we get to the interest rate, as you mentioned, Professor, any investment as a function of the both side of the GDP, on the demand side and the supply side.
Correct.
And the demand side, it's a main driver of one of the importance of the aggregate demand, the size of the investment. On the supply side, any investment is going to build up more additional capacity that is going to bring in. So now we see clearly the Dream Run is one would also call it as a golden period. You had a simultaneous expansion of the capacity at one level. You also had a sustained demand coming from the domestic as well as international. But now it looks like the capex expenditure, as I mentioned, is also why is it generated some what we would call as a crowding in? Maybe one would expect that would some kind of crowding in instead of, because given the demand consent system, obviously expenditure here is a capex, not a revenue expenditure, but still is a is some kind of expenditure, would suddenly drive growth, one would expect. So what is that link that is missing in to build that momentum? Is the ones, because the addition why this is, I'm saying this particularly important, there's an estimation which shows roughly around 11% of the corporate assets are sitting. They are simply not investing. It is not even lack of money with the corporate. In fact, most of them have a surplus money with them of the private capital. Why it is not being invested? In one level, you have expenditure on the side of the crowding in of the government expenditure. Some kind of push is happening, but yet that hasn't translated into pulling in of the private investment into the system. Yeah.
Right. So I actually happened to have a conversation with an industrialist.
Okay. Nice.
So I asked him that, according to him, what is it that's keeping investments from growing at the scale? I mean, this gentleman owns a factory that manufactures wires, so heavy duty wires, right? And they are really looking at the export market, and most of what they produce are going into the export market. So he told me that, look, as long as there is a buoyant growth in demand, investment is going to come. So I think that supply side element is taking a backseat in the Indian context so far as demand is concerned. If you look at the government and if you simply look at their tax policy, we simply have not had anything that gives a major tax break.
But how it is seen as, since this budget has provided income tax relaxation, is partly to push up the private consumption, that would actually drive the growth. That's an assumption that I think is being played out. Yes.
So maybe they're finally being pushed into realizing that something needs to be done on the demand side.
Okay.
Because the middle class, the so-called middle class, is of course very, very small in comparison to the overall distribution of income, but they are absolutely sizable given our numbers, right? The middle class consists of they account for a sizable proportion of aggregate domestic demand. So maybe an increase in their taxable income is something that is going to spur demand, because on the supply side, the constraints stand well addressed. There is evidence, as you point out, to show that there is crowding in so far as the Indian economy is.
And I think, if you remember, you and Professor Bhanamurthy has written very long back of, I think if I'm right with the capital expenditure, how much is the capital expenditure plays in driving the demand, and how much is the multiplier effect, the size of the multiplier, how much coming from the revenue spending, how much is coming from the capital expenditure. So I was wondering if do you see any that is relevant, instead of thinking of the expenditure, what kind of expenditure is a key in terms of driving the aggregate demand? Can you just reflect on that, Professor?
Let me see if I've understood your question right. So you're saying what kind of government expenditure right now is likely to drive domestic
growth? Since we know the government expenditure per se need not to deliver or push up the aggregate demand. Maybe the quality of the expenditure, the kind of expenditure plays more important role in driving aggregate demand. For instance, whether it is putting money in the maybe NREGA versus or of the capex you mentioned, or the other forms of expenditure. Does it matter in terms of thinking of simply Keynesian multiplier?
Right. So I really don't have numbers.
Okay.
So what I can simply suggest is based on what should I say? Kind of back of the envelope kind of calculations and my perception of the Indian economy. We need to really get all guns growing. So if you spend on schemes like the NREGA and expand those sorts of schemes, that's going to put in more money in the rural system, and that would have very obvious spin-offs for growth in your FMCG kind of products, right, and call for investments in those sectors, right. Now, if you, for instance, give a tax break to the middle class and the pay commission, have an expansionary effect to the pay commission, then you can have aggregate demand, of sort of these consumer durables, more sort of people taking more vacations, so your airports get utilized more, right? As well as capital expenditure, which also pumps money into the bottom half of the population. So I think more than all of this, this particular government's whole stance has been very, very supply side. That give more credit, ease the terms of credit, target women, and of course on expenditure on health, particularly through things like their Ujjwala Yojana, for instance, which addresses household health by switching to a cleaner fuel. So while they have incurred a lot of expenditure on those elements, right? The direct demand pushing expenditure has not yet been coming through.
So now, this also allows us to ask a little broader question. So we are thinking of why the private investment has not been picking up as it used to be the case. Now, can we divide the private investment versus a corporate one versus MSME? Is there any qualitative difference between the drivers of the investment, say, for corporate sector versus MSME, in the sense how much these are sensitive to the interest rate or with the demand side of the anything in that?
So let's split this into two parts. Drivers of investment by the large corporates and drivers of investment for the MSME sector. Now, the MSME sector has, firms in the MSME sector face a credit constraint because the chief source of borrowing from them is the banks. India does not yet have a very developed bond market, a corporate bond market. So these firms are often not able to raise money through the stock market. They are not able to raise money through the bond market, which basically leaves the banks for them. And apart from banks, they have to rely on their own funds or their operating surplus. Now, banks, on the other hand, have a lot of due diligence to carry out before they lend to the MSMEs. So, if you like, from the bank side, the first port of call is not the MSME sector. They would much rather lend to the large corporates where the due diligence has to be less because these are big names and you have to do a lot more in terms of knowing your borrower so far as the MSME is concerned. So that would be one factor. The credit constraint would be one factor that keeps MSME investments from increasing to the extent possible. And here actually the government has done a lot.
Much better, yeah.
And one of the key developments that we have witnessed is banks have lent a lot to the non-banking financial corporations. And the non-banking financial corporations who borrow from the banks are often lending to these MSMEs. So they fill that gap. They fill that knowledge gap that banks have in directly reaching out to the MSMEs. So a lot has been done in easing the credit constraint of the MSME sector. Now, obviously, the demand factor would also be constraining investments over there, but it's much more on the supply side for the MSME sector than perhaps on the demand side.
Demand side for us and for the case of the corporate sector. But this is from Soumya, I think, of the question, since it's something directly related to the today topic also for the evening. This is already entered in the domain of one side you have of the corporate sector as a surplus has not been investing. Other side the banks are not lending enough to the at least MSME. Of course, that is filled by the non-financial sector. What are the policy measures? Of course, we're going to discuss in the evening. But since I'm preempting that since the question has come from Soumya, what are the policy measures that you think beside the financial sector in giving credit to the MSME? What are the other policy measures has been taken to address this issue of the trade balance sheet problem? Yeah.
Okay. So, well, if you ask me for very exact measures that have been taken, I don't really kind of have a list. But this particular budget in particular has taken up a lot of measures to ease banks lending to the NBFCs and also to the MSMEs. So this is one area that the government is certainly looking at, right? So now I'm afraid if you ask me in terms of exactly what has happened, I really don't have that on my fingertips right now. Okay, but so I'll just give you one small example. Now there was a crisis among the NBFCs. There was a huge NBFC called ILFS, which had actually run into a problem, and so this was in the late 2020. So about 2018-19, there was a crisis in ILFS. Now post that, and also post increasing exposure of banks to the NBFC sector, the risk weight of lending to NBFCs had been increased. Now when a risk weight is increased, it means you have to set aside more capital if you lend to these particular segments. So as a bank, if you are lending to a sector whose risk weight is higher, you have to provision more capital, set aside more capital for doing so. So that risk weight has been brought down. So the government is actually trying to, as you know, the interest rate is being brought down, but there hasn't been passed through. Despite the interest rate, the repo rate being reduced in 2 rate cut cycles, the deposit rates haven't really come down. Now, without the deposit rates coming down, it's not really sort of rational to expect the lending rates to come down. Right? So these are some of the microprudential measures that the RBI has taken in terms of reducing the risk weight of lending to NBFCs and trying to encourage bank lending to NBFCs, because that is going to lead to more lending to the MSME sector.
So, Prof, this is again allow us to ask another question, something that you have already worked on, of the question of the transmission problem. It's
right.
Partly also to do with of course, not directly, but of course, it's also an issue in India that anything that, of the monetary measures that RBI takes that does not really translate into, because maybe there are the intermediaries, the chain of the institutional structure is such that it doesn't happen. So, what are the key constraints or the issues that we see in transmission problem?
Yeah. So, I think in India, if you look at the financial markets, the depth as well as the breadth of the financial market is still not of such an extent where we can say that firms do not face a credit constraint, particularly the MSME sector, firms in the MSME sector. So if you look at the bond market is practically non-existent in the Indian scenario. Now that is something which allows for anonymous borrowing, right, for small entities. I mean, they could float bonds and people could pick those up and have trade in bonds. Now, if you have studied economics at some point, you would have read about something called the ISLM model. Now, in our ISLM model, which economists normally talk about it, the entire monetary pass-through is based on something called the bond market. Now, that itself is not something that exists. That's one issue. Now, the second is we actually have huge informal credit markets, and bringing that under the formal sector is something which would certainly help, because it's not like MSMEs are not raising credits for through informal sources. They are doing so. And this is where, if you come from an arts background, if you come from sociology or political science background, you will be aware of this term called social capital. So social capital is very, very important in accessing loans in the informal market. So in MSMEs, for instance, the family connections, the family ties remain very, very important, and sources of credit as well. So kinship ties, caste ties, all of these remain important even when it comes to raising money in the financial money for, raising credit for running firms at the level of small and medium firms.
So this would fall under largely incompleted market, underdevelopment of still of the certain capital market and other. So this is something allows me to ask more fundamental questions. So we know of we had a dream run of 2003 to at least 2014, or around that, at least crisis, economic crisis, little than since at least I think 2011 or 12 onwards, we have been seeing this stagnancy. Now there's a big debate. If you shift from the domestic to the international domain, is before going to the US, neighbors to China. India has been having an enormous trade deficit with China. Yeah. And one assumption is China plus strategy in the sense of the rise of the cost of doing business going up in China, and there are other geopolitical reasons, COVID, supply chain. There is a concern of moving of the factories or things from China to other countries, which India has not been able to take advantage. Even Vietnam is able to do, or Bangladesh is able to do. So, because why I am asking this question, since you mentioned that India had some kind of achievement closer to the East Asia levels of investment at some point, but despite that, what is that fundamentally missing here, which the other East Asian countries could take advantage of from China plus, that India is not able to do? Since once you mentioned of the capital market has not penetrated, it's not enough developed, there may be income market failure in other segment. Is there anything else that we can think of structurally economy is such that despite we had an experience of dream rent, but yet we are not able to exploit the opportunity that come in the sense that many companies in China are willing to relocate from China to, because the cost has gone up. So question is why India is not able to, because we have done a PLI of strategic sectors, but still of course there are pockets of success, but broadly speaking we have not been able to take advantage of that, what they call as a China plus one strategy. What are the other factors that we think is missing in our structural variable that one would think of? Of course, supply constraint is definitely one of that. Supply capacity maybe of the
Right. So, if I can point out in context of your question that there is one area in which India has shown remarkable success, which we have not seen in its East Asian neighbors, and that's in the service sector. So, if
IT in particular, IT in particular.
IT in particular, and the entire, outsourcing, offshoring, and now, friend-shoring kind of models that are being discussed. So the service sector has benefited immensely from capital inflows, right, from foreign direct investment. Why has not India had similar success so far as manufacturing is concerned?
That's a central question.
So I think that is the central question that you are asking. Now here, I think it's not India's weakness as much as its strength. So I think a chief point of difference between our East Asian neighbors, China and us, is our democracy. And that actually, and add to it another D, our diversity. Because I was just thinking, even as you asked, look at Bangladesh and India. So Bangladesh is at least a homogeneous country. Given. So we have as many types of Bangladeshis in each corner of India as you might ask for. So I think that diversity as an outsider is not something that's very easy to grasp, number one. And number two, India does not have an authoritarian government in power. Even though it has a government which has a majority, time and again we have seen over many issues that people's power has forced the government to backtrack. And this has happened in states this has happened perhaps in opposition ruled states more than in other states. But that is the kind of uncertainty that would prevent the setting up of manufacturing which comes as with a very long term in view, right? So that is something I also wanted to add to our discussion so far, that if you look at investment decisions, if you're having capex expenditure over 2 years, you may not see the investment coming up with, till the next 5 years, right? Maybe they are just in the stage of MOUs. They haven't really become projects as yet. After all, every state is doing its investor summit, and lots of MOUs are being signed. But it will get counted as investments when something on the ground actually happens. So that is something that's long term, and
basically the actual versus realized investment.
Yes, actual versus realized investment. So maybe the effect of the capex is something we are going to see in the years ahead.
Yeah.
Right?
Very much. So now it's again for the continuation of this question, China plus one strategy. Now there's also a discussion of directly, something everybody is interested, because when I asked them what is the question that you would like to ask Professor Ananya, they were all asking that you would like to know of America, particularly Trump tariff.
Yes.
What is that going to come up, how they are going to deal with it. So this is something now when it's discussed in the literature, articles that we see as a China and US plus strategy. Mm-hmm. Because why I say the China and US plus one, because the tariff that Trump imposed, now there is a pause on it, 90 days pause on most of the tariff. But of course China, there's certain tariff is on certain countries, but still broadly, while there's a tariff on India too, but there's also been a differential tariff in the sense there are countries which actually been imposed much higher than India. Yes. So many believe in India that this is an additional advantage for India, because our tariff, the tariff imposed on India is much lesser than the tariff imposed on other countries. Yes. Therefore, India could actually take advantage this. In fact, it is in the interest of India. In fact, it adds India's comparative advantage on certain sectors, particularly with our competitors in East Asia, because they are being imposed much higher tariff than us. Yes. So what that's any thought on this?
Just one thing.
Yes. Please.
I'm not sure if this is still relevant, because he has paused
for 90 days. Yeah, that's a hypothetical. Yeah, that's true. There is a pause on 90 days. Freeze on.
Is that true?
It's been frozen. We don't know. It's a statement.
Yes.
Because whereas that the earlier one was official statement unveiled in White House, but this is a statement, so we don't know whether it is. But assuming let us assume that it is going to, maybe after 90 days going to come back. But just wanted to understand what is that we can take advantage from the tariff. This is something Manoj asked from the
Yes. Hi. Okay. So before I address your question, I just want to add one thing which is flowing from our previous discussion on private investments. So I have worked on private investments, and what we found was uncertainty about the future is one of the biggest factors that affects private investments negatively. So you see what this is doing. First you have news of tariffs, then you have actual tariffs which are much higher than the news that was heard. Now you see that there's going to be a 90 days, perhaps there's going to be a 90 days freeze on implementation of the tariffs. All of this adds to uncertainty, which is very, very bad news for investments. Because investments are undertaken today where the returns are calculated over the future. So you see your whole process of calculating returns over that future becomes very, very hazy. Right? You don't get a clear picture of what the future looks like. So that's going to put your investment projects on hold. So uncertainty is one factor that we need to factor in. Now coming to Trump, you see on a lighter note, what Trump seems to have learned from India is India's policy of Atmanirbhar Bharat, because they seem to have launched an Atmanirbhar America, right? So this actually rings a bell for all of us who are students of Indian economics, because India started its planning with this whole policy of import substituting industrialization, and what used to be called yes.
No. The question? No. Please.
Yeah, import substituting industrialization. Yeah, so you had what is called an infant industry argument. This is something that was given, something we studied in our trade theories, which said that when industry is at a nascent phase, it requires protection from competition. What kind of competition? Especially from foreign competition, because foreigners, they have already developed that good and they are in a position to compete by lowering prices at levels at which our industry may not be able to compete. So there should be tariff walls, there should be tariff protection, because what do tariffs do? If there is a tariff, then when a good is entering the country from abroad, its price is whatever the price they have set plus the tariff. So there is a high price, which leaves a cushion for domestic industry, which may be high cost, and therefore it gets away also by charging a high price, right? So import substituting industrialization talks about imposing tariffs, and that's exactly what Trump has been giving as his logic to make America great again. He is imposing tariffs so that American industry's interests get protected and they are not subject to compete with low-cost imports from the rest of the world. Now, to me, what this really emphasizes is the role of something that was in what I have read, first pointed out by Professor Shukumar Chakraborty, which is the importance of domestic demand. You see, if you look at China, China has a huge domestic market. Do you know how low its import content of that market is? That market does not consume imported products. It's entirely producing, whatever they consume is produced by China. So the import content of Chinese consumption is extremely low. So I think the world as a whole has opened up, has woken up to the importance of its domestic demand. And I think as Indians also, we need to use that as a leverage. I don't remember exactly who, but I think one of our ministers made this comment that we can use our domestic market as a leverage. But definitely we should do that in providing graded access to our domestic market and promoting growth in the domestic market. So if you look at the rural sector particularly, where incomes are extremely skewed, because land ownership is very, very skewed, and along with that, rural income distributions also are very, very skewed. So if we can actually have, through our Make in India program, an industrialization process that manages to take off, and through that, and alongside that, an education policy that makes people at least employable in industry. For that, you don't need to go to college, you don't need to go to there's some high-level universities. School, after you finish school and you have 3 hours reading, writing and arithmetic, you should be able to get a basic job in industry. So this two-pronged policy, trying to boost aggregate demand and building a domestic industrial base that provides enough jobs for our youth, for our unemployed youth. I think that should be a policy priority for India. Now, do tariffs give us an advantage? The fact that we have lower tariffs than other countries, certainly it gives us an advantage, but it would be, in some sense, to my view, ideal if our comparative advantage comes on the basis of our domestic demand, and that is what then allows us to compete for foreign markets. I think to me that would be
great, definitely,
an
because
ideal.
India is the most populated country in the world. Obviously,
Right.
India has an huge potential of demand. But this again not a question of pessimism, even question of even thinking of the long run. There's now industrial policy in debate. I'll come back to the question later. Now, even for basic goods that India seems to be relying on China. The kind of the trade deficit that India has with China, it was something around almost similar or maybe equivalent of the trade surplus, something around 2000. Now it's 80 billion, 86 billion dollars. In fact, it is strategically it's more important than the other aspects of geopolitics, particularly of the economic dependency on China. So now, as you mentioned, in the short trend, you all know the Keynesian demand, aggregate demand, but matters in the short run in terms of driving, pumping. You see the capacity utilization is low, 75%, therefore it is useful. But in the long run, it is on the supply side.
Yes.
We need to build our capacity. We need to get our R&D done, because if you look at the productivity of most of the sectors, including the agriculture, we are nowhere close to China.
Yes.
So now, what are the strategies that something that, given our constraint, given our structural condition, what is that the India can do, or missing that the China had an advantage, therefore it could build that India is not able to do? Something that you can reflect on.
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the basic differences between India's failure, or I don't like using the word failure. The fact that China has outpaced us so much. So if you look at the 1980s, there was not that much difference between China and India so far as economic addition was concerned, even as late as the early 1980s, right? And then
almost similar per capita income. We were at a similar position, similar per capita income.
So something has happened at which they really outpaced us. Now, definitely what has happened is that China started, what China was producing for its own economy, it started producing for the world, and it kind of leveraged external markets very, very cleverly. What I think really lies behind, a couple of factors that lie behind China's success are entirely political economy factors. So one is, of course, their system of government, which puts far more authority with the government to do as it kind of requires, as requires to be done by industry. So a disciplined labor force. I'm not saying cheap. Okay, this is a disciplined labor force which would do the bidding of industry. That is something that China could ensure. Now, India cannot really have, I'm not saying China had suppression or repression, but for India that's a non-option. You really cannot have a suppressed or a repressed kind of a labor force and get away with it. You simply cannot. You have very strong trade unions and political parties to voice their angst, right? So that kind of discipline that the Chinese labor force was subjected to, I doubt that India can actually ever achieve. So that is one factor. The disciplined labor force that China could command. Because we have had some stories, these are all anecdotes, of how much repression the Chinese labor force has actually been subjected to. So a cheap Chinese doll, for instance, is often produced under conditions which you would not like to subject your labor force to. That's one. The second is mass education. We really need a focus on school education, basic education, at a level and of a quality that will deliver. That is somewhere I think India really missed the bus. When we became independent, we of course had an education program, and our IITs, our IIMs, our IISCs, all of those are products of the kind of policy that the Nehruvian education ministries put in place. But what happened to school education? I think that's really where we really missed the bus. You see, if you look at a book that was written by Adrian Wood on North-South trade, this was a long time ago. This was a book that was written to explain why you did not have what is predicted by the Hexter-Rowland theorem. The Hexter-Rowland theorem is a very classic theorem in trade theory, which says that as different economies trade with each other, as America trades with, let's say, India, you should have a factor of production getting paid the same wage in the same factor of production, right? You should it should be getting the same wage in America as in India, right? You have something called the factor price equalization theorem, which leads to this. Now that did not happen. So this book tries to explain why that did not happen, and in doing so, it recognizes that you have two kinds of skilled laborers in these developing countries. One that are highly skilled, right? Now these are the people who are employed in our outsourcing industries. They have MBAs, they have, they are accountants in many cases, they are CAs and all of those things. And then you have those who are skilled, but they only have a basic level of education. So they have, let's say, something of a school or maybe a school plus vocational training kind of education, so they can be employed in industry. This class is missing in India. So our school education, our vocational training education is really something that has not quite taken off to serve the needs of industry. So that's one reason I feel that we have not been able to sort of equal China's performance. And the third reason has to do with land reforms. So the kind of extreme inequality of wealth that you have in India today is just absolutely staggering. Now, this has happened today. We did not start with this level of wealth inequality. Now, you will find that even today, China's wealth inequality is much, much higher than what it used to be. But at least they started on an even keel. Now, what that does is, it gives you equality of opportunities. So equality of opportunities is something that China has really beaten us so far as, allowing your talents to come up to the extent.
So can you summarize then this discussion in terms of the experience of the China, the South Asia? There are certain 3 or 4 preconditions or a necessary condition to take off. Maybe one, as you mentioned, of the mass education. India, most of the Asian countries, successful countries, had a mass education at a much earlier level than what India. India actually achieved its full education with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan in 2000, late 2000. For India, most of the Asian countries had much before land reform and some kind of state capacity. Can we say that the ability to state implement some kind of that? I think these are necessary conditions most of the countries had, particularly in East Asia, which had a remarkable success, particularly if you see in the post, outside of the European or the northern countries. I think the only countries.
So even with the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the quality.
Learning outcomes, quality of education.
Yes. So I'll give you an example from Bengal, very recently. What has happened is, it was found that there was a lot of corruption in jobs being held at the school level. So the government has this exam based on which jobs are given to school teachers. Now there was a corruption in this, as a result of which the Supreme Court has announced that all the jobs should be scrapped. Now, as a result of that, the government schools in Bengal are now practically teacherless, because lakhs of positions have been filled up, and all those jobs have now been scrapped because of that corruption. So, obviously somebody who has a dream for his or her children is not going to be putting their child in a government school. They'll maybe borrow money but send them to a private school. And the private schools are by and large unregulated. So the quality of education that's being given out is not something that is standardized in any way. So we really have...
one last question, ma'am.
Yes.
We have been, as you mentioned, India had since 50s to 80s import substitution, and had which is considered to be Hindu rate of growth by Raj Krishna, and considered to be, later the analysis came as a failures. part, not failure, I would say, limits of the
Right.
import substitution
Model.
producing growth. India opened up 90s, we had a remarkable growth, just in India. This happened in the most of global south countries, which some form of economic planning they had, and by 90s or the 80s, most of the countries were asked, or the consensus was built to open up and embrace some kind of liberalization, what you call deregulation. Now we looks like we are actually again back to the square one. In the sense, we know something called Washington consensus, getting price right, getting institutions right. That were the earlier the keywords of. So now looks like there is a rise of protectionism everywhere, and industrial policy back debate. It was not a really acceptable word at some point in last. I mean, like say, 10 years, even 10 years before. Now there is a rise of protectionism, and some people even call globalization is dead.
Right.
In a way of every country deglobalization. So what is that you think is it something we should carefully handle it, or should we go selectively? Because there's also a fear we cannot go back of the pre-90s of the import substitution. So what is that new instead of going back? What is that new which is substantially different from the pre-90s scenario of import substitution? I mean, tough question, but just if you can reflect on.
Sure.
Then we can open up the other questions.
Yes. So I just want to say that there was a certain historical conjuncture that brought this wave of liberalization and globalization in the 1990s. One was the fall of the German Wall. So East and West Germany came together, and there was a fall of communism in East Germany. And the other was the collapse of the Soviet Union in early 1990s. So both of these was like a trophy for capitalism, and there really seemed to be no other alternative, because the major communist regimes had taken a huge hit. So it really seemed to be that in some sense capitalism had won this round, and there was no alternative other than to really go for a system wherein state gave up its controls and receded and basically did its basic minimum stuff of defense and other public goods, and left everything else to the market. So that is the context in which countries dismantled their barriers. Brazil was another case in point. And in 1991 there was a crisis, and what had begun for India in the 1980s as gradual steps towards liberalization became much more rapid and fast-paced after that 1991 balance of payments crisis, and we also opted for liberalization. So I think the basic point that the basic, not point, I should say, the basic difference that we saw in India post 1991 and prior to 1991 was the proliferation of competition, and that is something that's pretty good as a factor for disciplining the firms. So competition imposes a certain discipline on the firms. So otherwise, you really had, there were so many goods whose prices came down dramatically, right? So many FMCG products whose prices came down dramatically after once liberalization had happened, right? So that was one, and the second was I think choice. The variety that the consumer had available in India post 1991 was something which was very, very limited. To me, I think what really symbolizes this variety is if you grew up in pre-1991 India, what you could find on television. There was some, we used to have this thing called the Metro channel, on which every once a week there would be some Hindi film songs, and that was, the height of entertainment. Weekends there would be 2 or 3 movies, and that's all we saw. Now if you look at TV today, it's 24/7, you have a sort of a choice of watching films or series or documentaries. So that really personifies to me the kind of choice that the consumer had. I think the other thing was, the other couple of things were something like surf. So if you wanted to wash clothes, you had surf. But if you want to wash clothes today, there are so many detergents that are available. If you wanted shoes, you had Bata. And Bata was a foreign company. Whereas today, if you want to buy shoes, you have so much choice that's available to you.
Mobile, madam. Mobile.
Yes,
the phone.
not to
Phone,
even-
you have to get a number of years to wait for the queue to get one phone connection.
Telephone connection.
at home.
And there was, you knew whose house had the telephone connection in your entire neighborhood.
Yeah.
Because fridge.
Yeah.
So I don't think we need to go back to India, that India. However, I think the discipline of competition. So what came under the garb of state control in pre-1991 India was a very close nexus between the capitalists and the state. So you actually had some amount of crony capitalism back then also. So I think that is what we need to really avoid. We have the institutions in place. You now have the Competition Commission, which can regulate the amount of competition in the market. So I think if that gets going, and if we put some safeguards for the domestic market, but allow entry of foreign goods. I mean, put a tariff, but don't have a quota which bans the entry of foreign goods beyond a point. I think that should be the way ahead.
Great, wonderful. You have some few questions. Yeah, please.
Yes.
We'll take few questions.
Sir, two questions. So almost every economist actually, right?
Yes.
So they talk about GDP growth rate, but they somewhere have a diluted view about the per capita income. They don't give enough emphasis, or let it be papers or the growth, whatever they talk on the TV, they talk about growth. And only thing they talk is that the GDP. We stand fifth in the GDP and probably 140th in the per capita income. Like you rightly say, we did miss the bus. What China has took off in probably 1980s probably is because of a lack of mass education and improper social equity, which didn't give them enough opportunity. Probably, let's say, if we had enough per capita income in 1980s, isn't this related? Like if probably we stop looking at the growth rate in the eyes of from the GDP, and we switch to let's say we give enough limelight to the per capita income, isn't this sorted already? Like if the per capita income is right, probably the mass education would solve by itself, and the social equity would solve by itself, and in turn the consumption or everything is the top-down approach is growth.
Right.
Growth itself will solve the problem.
Yeah, if we focused on per capita income. So let me collect the questions and then I'll answer it. Yes.
My question is, you are pointing out on the making India and Atmanirbhar.
Yeah.
Although India proactively started in September 2014, I guess. It's been
Right.
nearly 10 years.
Correct.
So why are we still lag and still pointing out on the other side of the coin? So I still don't find the gap is again big. So it's been 10 years, but still the dependency on the supply side again it's on the negative on the larger scale. It's increased actually. So I'm not,
What has increased?
the support for Make in India.
Yeah,
Actually
yeah.
on realization it's not actually been done. Though it's been 10 years of gap. This number of years is very huge.
Yeah.
So you are saying the
We should
effort
have
is
achieved
not
it.
in.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Actually,
why
we
is
should
Make
have-
in India not giving results even after 10 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, just one second.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for the spectacular discussion. It was so diverting and very engaging.
Thank you.
Coming up today morning at 4 o'clock, for some reason I was reading this Harvard University working paper. And since we're talking about lack of industrialization and so this paper was actually by Aaron Subramanian and Ghosh. And so they essentially talk about three risks, what the industrialists perceive and what actually stops them from investing. I don't want to talk about the other two risks, they are quite political problems. The first one is regulations favor to national champions in India for the past how much years of this government. And so what I felt a bit constricted is that China had a similar kind of phenomenon where they also favor national champions like evergreen real estate giants or ByteDance or Jacob Ma's, Alibaba. So China also did something similar, but they successfully visualized it. So what's actually stopping India from doing it? For example, PGW is a very common example where Jinder, who is an MP of BJP, is actually investing $1 billion in smelting plant in, I believe it's Austria or somewhere else, rather than investing in India. And he's actually from BJP. So, in theory, these national champions, are we actually at a disadvantage what China actually took it as an advantage?
Okay, so why don't our industrialists,
Despite doing regulatory favors for these said national champions?
why don't our industrialists invest in India? Right, that's really what you're asking. Right, okay.
Maybe.
Just have
Question,
one
yeah,
thing
actually.
to add to this question on national champions. I think, have we understood the idea of national champions like rightly? Because we don't have any brands or specialized kind of companies that you can talk of. Instead, what we call as national champions are basically just, kind of crony capitalists who want to do everything. So, I mean, is the problem the nature of capitalism itself?
So something like a Samsung or a...
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so... Okay.
Please go ahead.
When we look at the Asian economy, despite their political policies, they also quoted their Confucius tradition played a role in their development of the economy. Is there any cultural tradition or influence in Indian economy since independence that shaped the Indian economy?
Cultural tradition.
Yes, cultural factor, experiment. Okay, so one more question. Last
Sure.
question we're going to take. Yeah, please. We'll just give an opportunity to everybody.
Sure.
Yeah.
You spoke about the workforce discipline in China. So given that the aging workforce in China, like we have this potential age group in our country, do you see with the reforms that the current government in the last decade that they have initiated, do you see that reflecting in the GDP growth touching in the double digit in the upcoming decade? Given that they have set the target for 2047 pushing Bharat.
Yeah.
So it is a timeline for us to reach the double rate growth. It hasn't been done in the last 1 decade. So do you see that digit touching the...
So whether will India achieve given the growth rate of the...
Double-digit growth.
That's a big question. Open-ended. Okay, Professor, yeah, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, first of all, I think if I get your question right, what you're saying is if we focused on the per capita income more than we did on just GDP, then development would have taken care of itself. So, let me first tell you that if you look at the public discourse, especially let's say in the media, the focus is on GDP. But if you look at the policy making discourse, the focus is on per capita income, because that is really what matters. It's not just the size of the cake, which is the GDP, but it's the share that each one would get if the share was divided equally. It's another thing that the share is not equal, right? Per capita income just is a possibility that if everybody got an equal share, how much would they get? But actually, the share is extremely unequal, with some people having a lot and some people getting very little. So, even if you focused totally on per capita income, which is actually something that the policymakers do, development does not take care of itself. So, in economics, we have this whole division between the concept of growth and the concept of development. So, development encompasses a much wider and holistic view of well-being, which includes education, which includes health. Okay, so you cannot really say that if growth happens, development will take care of itself, especially because growth by itself may not be very equally distributed across the nation. Development is about achieving equality of opportunities, which comes with institutions. So school education is one such institution, for instance. Now, having good schools but making them very expensive does not help. So we need schools that are government schools which give quality education, something that was actually happening in Delhi, with the AAP government, we suddenly, for the first time that at least I have seen, we had a government which was talking about school education. I mean, what they did is a different thing. I mean, they may not have done all of that. Had they done it, they may not have lost as much as they did. But that's a different thing. But at least they were saying that we need quality schools, we need to address the gap, and so on and so forth. So that does not take care of itself. The policymaker needs to separately give it attention. Good schools, good hospitals. So something that the Ayushman Bharat scheme tries to put in place. Low cost quality medical attention for the poor. That is something that the state has to come and do to support the development process. So if you look at Sri Lanka is an example. It's not a very high growing country, but it has achieved very high levels of development. That has come through state expenditure. Okay, so that's the first question. Now, you see, one of the things that Make in India envisages is not industrialization per se. It wants industrialization for exports. So that has really been the kind of difference that they have drawn between the ISI model and this particular model of the government. They have said that we want foreign industries to come, set up plants in India and to manufacture from here. That hasn't happened. That, as his question was, we seem to have missed the bus. And I think the kind of reasons that I have discussed as a response to that question are the ones that contribute to Make in India not being such a success. And to my mind, it is the political economy factors. It's entirely the political economy factors. So look, where you have like a very strong state, let's say Uttar Pradesh, they have actually benefited from Make in India. So you have some FDI come in, because the state there has shown that they can eliminate crime, literally eliminate crime in a way that many other states have not done, which shows that you have a very strong state in power, and they have which can possibly discipline its labor if required, and you have had some results. So our democracy, the fact that we can create so much noise, and I value that. I think we should all value that freedom that we have to create as much noise as we like. Is also something that keeps us from progressing at a rate that authoritarianism has made possible.
And also include the Atmanirbhar.
Yes, Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India are, so the Atmanirbhar came after COVID actually. Yeah, where the global for going vocal for local, where you're trying to produce for domestic markets. So all of that is definitely very much there. So why don't our industrialists invest in India? For the very kind of reasons that other industrialists. So you see, industrialists see things very similarly. Like an Indian industrialist would essentially not first think about the country. They're going to first think about their profits. I'm not saying that they are not nationalists. I mean, of course they are nationalists, they are living in India, etc. But when it comes to making money, they will see where can the money be made. And wherever it can be made, they will go there. Right? So they also possibly view the same set of constraints, which comes out of, let's say there's a certain state which gives you a benefit and you come. Right? And then that government loses the election. Now the minute the government loses the election, the next government goes to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court says, no, the license is not yours, which is something that happened to Vodafone, right? So if you look at the case with Vodafone, they had to pay retrospective they had to pay some compensation with retrospective effects. You just look into the Vodafone case to see what I'm trying to talk about. That it's very uncertain what kind of costs you may have to bear in the course of your doing business, which has to do with political economy factors and with certain governments being in power and certain governments not being in power and so on. I'll give you another small example. In Delhi, the AAP government had set up something called Mohalla clinics. A Mohalla clinic is basically a localized medical center Now, once the BJP government came to power, it has shut all those mohalla clinics, right? It is making some alternate arrangement for health. But suppose you were a private provider associated with the mohalla clinics, it's just being shut down. There's nothing that you can do, right? So these kinds of things in a democracy, the party in power can change, they can change policy. All of that adds to the uncertainty of doing business. So capital would much rather go somewhere where they're being promised that, for the next 20 years, nothing can happen. No government can promise for the next 20 years in India. They themselves last for 5 years, right? So I think that has something to do with that. Now, why don't we have national champions? It has to possibly do with some kind of, lack of industrial depth. I mean, we have come in, the Tatas, for instance, would definitely be a national champion. Now, they have grown in this particular circumstance, right? Once upon a time, it used to be the Birlas, right? So now, of course, you have, other names coming up. But the Tatas have sort of lasted through and through. So, I guess I really don't have an answer to why we don't have these kinds of champions. But I'll tell you why Korea has theirs. So in Korea you have these chaebolls, which are these huge industrial houses, and Samsung is one, LG is one, and so on. Or is LG Chinese? LG is Korean, right, yes. So, you have strategic state intervention. The state kind of looked at what would be best for industry and supported industrial transformation in that particular way. Created the kind of condition that would give rise to these chaebolls. Now that is something we don't really have. I mean, Make in India is a kind of blanket policy, but we don't have the kind of strategic intervention that Korea had managed to have. Now maybe that's because of the size. Look at the size and homogeneity of Korea, and once again, their form of government, and look at the kind of government that we have. So maybe crafting that may also be much more difficult in the Indian context. But just to sort of, I'll come to your question later, just to kind of take your question first. Are we going to have double-digit growth in 2040, till 2047? Who knows, we may. Because, this government is making a lot of the right noises. It's easing the credit constraint, it's spending on capex, it's giving tax breaks to the middle class, it's talking about sort of cutting red tape, reducing bureaucratic hassles, and over time, who knows, all of these policies may deliver with time, and we may actually well have double-digit growth in the period going up to 2047. Because there is a time when all of these will have their positive effects, especially once the uncertainty reduces. Because you see, now what's happened is you have a coalition government, and the recent bill that was passed in Parliament, there is a lot of rumors that some of the allies may be changing their stance and all of that stuff. So that also brings in an element of uncertainty, and investment requires stability over a long horizon. Now, you see, I think that's a really nice question. Have cultural traditions shaped our economic policies, right? That's roughly what you wanted to ask. Now, you see, I really don't think they have in a very explicit way. And I think one reason for not doing that is because there is no cultural tradition. India has cultural traditions and cultural traditions, right? So maybe if you take, I haven't really looked at this question, so offhand I won't be able to give you an answer. But if you look at the state level growth stories closely, who knows, maybe you are going to have cultural traditions, shape economic policies. So for instance, you look at Uttar Pradesh government, once the Yogi government came into power, they said that no more beef slaughter. So there you have a cultural tradition shaping economic policy. A whole industry which was running till then is something that would get affected, and now they will be producing for other markets, not for their domestic markets, right? So that is one example. I think what you have had to some extent, I mean, something that we have overall as a Indian cultural tradition would be perhaps the Gandhian tradition. That is very, very pan-India and sort of is over and above the cultural traditions that you have, which are linked to perhaps your religion and your language, linguistic and those traditions. So the Gandhian tradition is one of a self-sufficient economy, and that is definitely something we have not subscribed to, except for maybe this going vocal for local tries to bring it back. So I have a feeling if you search, you're going to have more examples of cultural traditions.
Which are specific to certain regions,
Yes,
but
yes.
not uniform to the
Not
whole of the
uniform,
nation.
because there is no uniform culture. Right.
Just want to read one passage in support of national champion and Korea's case. Just picked up
Yes.
what I was discussing. The Korean military dictator, President Park Chung-hee, threw the country leading businessman in jail when he came to power in 1961. He's a military dictator. When he came to power, he put the leading businessman in jail. But the businessman was released after the president extracted promises from the businessman that they would each undertake specific industrial investment.
Yeah, so it's like
In the sense, this is you call as a developmental state in an authoritarian regime, and the developmental state are policies in a democratic regime. So we cannot
do that.
Ask, if you don't invest here, then I will not let you go or something. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Such an enriching conversation, and really, in fact, privileged to have you here, and really a very enlightening conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you
Given
so
your
much.
tight schedule, and you make it
Not
here,
at
made
all.
it here,
It's
and
such
wonderful.
a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.